She looked up at me and said, "Why didn't you come sooner?" Matteo froze his breath, his heart the world itself. The girl's voice was barely louder than a whisper, but it shattered 9 years of silence in an instant. Her hand clutched a torn drawing of the villa he once called home. She shouldn't have known it. She shouldn't have remembered. Yet there she stood, hazel eyes glinting with forgotten memories. Could it really be her? If this moment made your heart skip, share what you felt in the comments and don't scroll away. The truth is only just beginning to unfold. In the heart of Florence, under the fading hues of an Italian autumn sky, renowned architect Julian Mercer walked the cobbled streets in silence. Once celebrated across Europe for his visionary designs, Julian now lived a quieter life, his fame dulled by tragedy. 9 years had passed since that dreadful spring afternoon when his wife Celeste and their infant daughter Isabella vanished in a car crash while visiting her family in Cinque Terre. Celeste's body was recovered. Isabella's never was. The grief had driven Julian to the edge. He sold their coastal villa and left Rome, burying himself in work, moving from one city to another until he settled into the quiet rhythm of Florence. Yet, even with the passage of time, he could not silence the question that haunted him. What if she was still alive? On a breezy Friday morning, Julian strolled through the Sant'Ambrogio market, seeking ingredients for dinner. He had grown fond of cooking an act that reminded him of the simpler joys Celeste once embraced. While examining a bunch of rosemary, his attention was drawn to a child's laughter, a sound bright and fleeting. He turned instinctively. Near a small bakery cart stood a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, helping an elderly vendor arrange baskets of bread. She wore a faded yellow scarf, and her soft brown curls spilled from beneath a knit cap. But what struck Julian like a lightning bolt were her eyes, piercing hazel with gold flecks unmistakably Celeste's. He froze. His chest tightened. He knew those eyes. The girl noticed him watching and quickly looked away, retreating behind the stall. Her movements were careful, almost rehearsed, as though she had been taught not to linger or speak to strangers. Julian approached cautiously, not wanting to frighten her. He greeted the vendor, an older woman named Rosa, who smiled warmly. "She's helping you today?" Julian asked casually. "Ah, that one, she's always around," Rosa replied. "Quiet little thing, but she works hard, calls herself Bella." Julian's pulse skipped. "Bella. Where does she live?" he asked, trying not to sound too eager. Rosa gave a shrug. "With some woman on the edge of town, I think. Never seen the mother myself." That evening, Julian couldn't sleep. His mind swirled with memories and questions. Could it be Isabella? The possibility felt dangerous, but ignoring it was worse. The next morning, he returned to the market with purpose. From a discreet distance, he watched as Bella arrived, carrying a worn tote filled with bread loaves. The same knit cap, the same careful steps. Julian noticed a stern-looking woman waiting for her near the corner, a woman with sharp features and an impatient stance. Bella handed over the tote, and the woman immediately pulled her away, walking briskly through the alleys. Julian followed from afar. They walked for nearly 20 minutes until they reached an aging apartment building on Via della Robbia. Julian marked the address. However, something else troubled him. If the woman was her guardian, why did Bella seem so frightened around her? Why wasn't she in school on a weekday? Over the next week, Julian observed them multiple times. Bella always carried groceries, ran errands, and kept her head low. She didn't play, didn't laugh unless alone. Julian confided in a close friend, Luisa Ferraro, a retired magistrate known for her sharp instincts and deep compassion. After hearing the story, Luisa promised to investigate discreetly. Within days, she returned with alarming news: there was no record of any child named Bella living at that address. No school registration, no medical history. It was as if the girl didn't officially exist. Outside the paper trail, Louisa also learned the woman's name, Carla D'Amico. Carla had a minor record years ago, mostly involving forged documents and petty fraud. Nothing significant, but enough to raise suspicions. Julian's heart raced. He needed more than a hunch. He needed proof. One afternoon, under the guise of offering leftover focaccia, Julian approached Bella directly. He crouched down to her level and handed her the warm bread. "It's for you," he said gently. "Do you like to draw?" She looked puzzled, but nodded slowly. He smiled, pulling a small notebook and colored pencils from his coat. "I used to draw all the time with someone who looked just like you. She had your smile, your eyes." Bella hesitated, then took the notebook. She whispered, "Grazie," and turned to go, but not before looking back once, unsure. That night, Julian held the empty notebook close. He didn't know if she would use it or throw it away, but it was a bridge, a silent one. All he could do now was wait. However, the next morning, something unexpected happened. Tucked inside his mail slot at the apartment building was a folded sheet. Julian opened it slowly. It was a drawing, childlike but specific. A villa by the cliffs, an olive tree near the window, a small girl on a swing. Julian dropped to the floor, breath gone from his lungs. It was their old home. Only one person could have drawn that. Isabella was alive, and she was trying to tell him. The morning sun broke gently over the rooftops of Venice, casting golden reflections across the winding canals. The air smelled of salt and morning dew, and boats began to stir, gliding silently through narrow waterways. Matteo Romano stood by the window of his rented apartment, a small cup of espresso warming his hand, but his thoughts were far from the postcard beauty before him. The drawing. That single innocent drawing by a girl he'd barely met was haunting him more deeply than any business deal or personal loss ever had. He had memorized every detail: the red-roofed villa, the narrow bridge, the large olive tree, and most importantly, the river curling just below it. These weren't merely imagined sceneries. They were fragments of a memory, his memory, specifically of his old home near Florence, the one he'd sold right after the accident. The house he had once shown to his daughter Alessia in baby photos. She had loved those pictures, always reaching out to touch the painted tiles in the photographs. He could almost hear her baby laughter echoing in his mind. However, what disturbed Matteo most was the possibility that the girl he had seen in Burano, the one called Livia, was indeed Alessia. Not just by chance or vague resemblance, but by something deeper. The emerald eyes, the way she clutched the cup of hot chocolate with both hands, the careful way she avoided eye contact with adults as if conditioned to disappear. He knew he needed help. This wasn't something he could handle with his fortune or influence alone. Matteo reached out to his old contact inspector, Arianna Della Torre. Arianna had been the lead investigator 9 years ago when the accident happened. She was the one who had delivered the devastating news that Alessia's body had not been found, that it was likely she had been swept away by the river or, worse, abducted. She had always believed there was more to the case, but with no solid leads it eventually turned cold. "Arianna, it's Matteo." He began, his voice firmer than he felt. "I found something, or someone. I need your help." There was a pause on the other end, followed by her sharp intake of breath. "Where are you?" "Venice. Burano, to be exact." "I'll be there tonight. Send me what you have. And Matteo, please be sure. I don't want you to relive all that pain again." As he sent her the scanned image of Livia's drawing and a few grainy photos he had taken discreetly, Matteo felt the first glimmer of hope flicker. Not certainty, just hope, brittle and small. Meanwhile, in a cramped kitchen just off the Grand Canal, Livia was carefully drying the dishes under the watchful eye of Signora Donati. The woman was stern, her gray hair always pulled tight, her tone clipped and demanding. Livia was used to it. Her life was a routine of errands, scolding, and silence. However, something felt different since the encounter with the kind stranger. She had told no one about the man who had given her the hot chocolate, but she had stared at the cup for hours afterward, and the warmth he left behind had stayed in her hands longer than the drink itself. She didn't understand why his gaze felt familiar, or why her chest tightened when she thought about him. But in the pocket of her threadbare coat she had hidden a small treasure, a crumpled note with the name of a cafe, and an address given by the local baker Marta, who sometimes slipped her a cookie and kind words. Later that afternoon, Ariana arrived, bringing with her a flood of memories and a new resolve. Matteo and Ariana sat in a quiet corner of the cafe, studying the files together. The more she saw, the more concerned she became. The girl's not in any school registry, not in any health system. Matteo, this is serious. She's being hidden. Someone doesn't want her to be found. I thought the same. And the woman with her, they call her Signora Donati, but I can't find any records under that name. Then we dig deeper. I still have contacts in the local precinct and the immigration department. If she's off the grid, someone's helping keep her that way. Outside, the canals whispered with the rhythm of gondolas and chatter, unaware that in one small cafe, a father and an inspector were rewriting the course of a 9-year-old tragedy. By evening, Ariana had unearthed several pieces of troubling evidence. The woman, known as Signora Donati, had no legal identification, no rental contract for the house she lived in, and no tax records. She was a ghost. More concerning was her last known alias, Giuliana Moretti, a former associate of an infamous smuggler named Lorenzo Bianco. Years ago, Lorenzo had been a suspect in several child trafficking investigations, but had never been convicted. His disappearance shortly after Alessia went missing had raised red flags, but no connections had been found at the time. Ariana leaned back, her expression grim. Matteo, if this woman is Giuliana and she has Alessia, then this is bigger than just a missing child. This is about networks, about hiding children for a price. Matteo's knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. Then we bring them down, every one of them. However, things weren't that simple. They had no solid proof. Livia, or Alessia, was still legally missing, and if Giuliana suspected they were onto her, she could vanish overnight. They needed to be careful. The next day, Matteo waited outside the fish market where Livia often came with Giuliana. He stayed back disguised in a hooded jacket. As they walked past, he caught Livia's eyes for a brief second. She paused, recognizing him. Her steps slowed. He could see the hesitation in her movement, the question in her eyes. However, Giuliana yanked her forward by the wrist, muttering something harsh under her breath. That was the moment Matteo decided. He would no longer stand back. He followed at a safe distance, watched them return to the cramped apartment above a butcher shop, and noted the alleyway escape route. That night, while the city lit up with music and tourists floated down moonlit canals, Matteo met with Ariana and a trusted team from the local police. They had a plan to use Matteo's resources to install surveillance to track every move Giuliana made, and most importantly, to find proof that Livia was truly Alessia Romano. Hope, once flickering now, burned with intent. But even in that warmth, a chill remained. Because the truth, no matter how carefully uncovered, would never come without consequence. The night settled over Venice like a velvet cloak, muffling footsteps, and blending shadows with the shimmering lights that danced across the canals. Matteo Romano stood at the edge of the Palazzo Ducale's courtyard, the weight of his intentions pressing on him like the humidity in the air. He had moved from being a grieving father into someone driven by purpose, but with purpose comes peril. He knew that Giuliana Moretti, the woman he suspected of hiding his daughter Alessia, was not just a caregiver. She was a phantasm encapsulated by lies, forged identities, and untraceable paperwork. However, understanding her true identity would require breaking through layers of illusion. Giuliana had created a shadow world for Livia, a realm where no official record existed, where phone numbers changed, and where each day blended into a choreography of obedience. It reminded Matteo of a metaphor his mother once used: when someone lives in a hall of mirrors, the truth becomes elusive because reflections distort reality. But every reflection ends somewhere. In this case, Matteo and Inspector Arianna Della Torre needed to find that final mirror break. They began by tracking Giuliana's nightly movements. Instead of merely trailing her, which risked detection, they planted a silent observer, a trusted undercover officer posing as a gondolier who would pass by near dusk. As the gondola glided past the pale facade of the apartment building where Livia lived, the gondolier captured a photograph of Giuliana stepping out with a suitcase and a small trembling hand holding Livia's. That moment, frozen in low-resolution pixels, was the only tangible confirmation yet that Livia was being moved, possibly out of Venice. But why move a child if her existence was meant to be hidden? Furthermore, why fragment her identity so completely? Arianna explained the concept with simple clarity. Imagine a single thread of silk. If you cut it, you can weave a new tapestry, but cannot recreate the original pattern without recognizing its weave. Giuliana did not stitch Livia into society. She cut the thread clean. In other words, by erasing every trace of Livia's origin, school records, medical visits, even the faintest interactions, Giuliana had ensured no one could trace her past. The only proof of her existence was the memory of a stranger, a fading whisper in Matteo's mind. Determined to weave back the pattern, Matteo and Arianna intensified surveillance. They discovered a safe house across the lagoon in a town called Murano. From a canal-side window, they observed Livia, seated on a windowsill, gazing out at glass-blown figurines with a distant expression. Giuliana entered the room, her silhouette backlit by the stained glass glow, and gently brushed Livia's hair. The sight struck Matteo not just the fragility of the moment, but the glimmer of recognition in Livia's eyes, as if a memory was surfacing behind her gaze. However confronting, Giuliana directly risked a chain reaction. If she suspected an approaching collapse of her secrets, she might vanish with Livia to another city or country, using her network of forged documents to move undetected. This scenario highlighted the complexity of human trafficking and identity erasure. It wasn't like a lost child poster that could be circulated. Instead, it was like chasing smoke. You could see it shift, blur, vanish, and reappear, but never grasp solidly. The fight was as much about timing as it was about evidence, so they supplanted direct risk with long-game strategy. Matteo leveraged his connections to legal documentation professionals, people who could comb through registries for mismatches, minor discrepancies, or overlooked alias filings. Meanwhile, Arianna coordinated with Interpol's liaison in Italy to place alerts on any passports or ID documents entering or leaving the country under Giuliana's known aliases. It was like putting a spider's web across Europe. Any attempt to pass through would leave a thread behind. Meanwhile, at night in Murano, Livia cried herself to sleep, murmuring a lullaby her mother had sung. In those moments, Matteo's heart shattered and surged with determination in equal measure. He longed to be there to comfort her, yet understood that any contact now could compromise everything. Protecting her meant risking his own instinct to bridge the gap physically. One evening, news broke that an unregistered passport under the name Giuliana Moretti had been flagged at the Austrian border. She was trying to board a train to Vienna. Matteo Ariana and the task force sprang into action. They coordinated with border police, authorized a quiet interception, and set a trap to intercept her and Livia before they could board the train. The unfolding tension mimicked the crescendo of a symphony, every note precise yet charged with suspense. As Giulia approached the train station with Livia by her side, Matteo watched from a distance, emotions conflating fear, hope, anguish, disbelief. In that moment, he realized something fundamental: survival wasn't just about rescue. For Livia, survival meant discovering the truth of who she was, and for Matteo, it meant reclaiming the fragments of fatherhood he had lost. But that reclamation had to happen at the right moment, one that wouldn't endanger the child he fought to protect. They moved in. Agents carefully intercepted Giuliana, removing her and Livia from the platform with minimal intrusion. As Livia lifted her head, confusion and fear warred in her eyes. It wasn't a tearful reunion yet. It was a flicker of recognition made stronger by the tiny tendrils of memory, awakened by being placed into safety. For the first time in years, she wasn't defined by the shadow that had secluded her. Ultimately, the glass walls Giuliana had built around Livia shattered not by brute force, but by the patient craft of strategy, surveillance, and timing. Matteo held his breath, not just for rescue, but for understanding the story behind the betrayal. The trauma of 9 lost years, and the irreplaceable bond that had driven him across European canals to reclaim the child he once held in silence. And even as the agents led Giuliana away, Livia, on Matteo's side, that night's shadows behind Venetian glass transformed. Not into clarity, but into something closer, a new beginning, flickering like candlelight beneath a stained glass window. The small interview room was quiet, except for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Matteo sat at one end, his hands folded tightly, knuckles white. Across from him sat Ariana, her file open, her tone gentle but firm. In the adjacent room, Livia Alacia was being evaluated by a trauma specialist. Though she had been rescued, the emotional barriers surrounding her were dense, fragile, and unpredictable. The first DNA results had come in hours earlier. The confirmation was beyond question. Livia was Alessia Romano Matteo's daughter. The probability listed was 99.998%, yet the magnitude of truth wasn't celebrated with champagne or warm embraces. It was met with stunned silence, as if reality had landed too heavily to lift. However, DNA could only confirm identity. It could not repair memories or bridge the time lost. Trauma, especially that experienced in early childhood, often leaves memory fragmented like a puzzle dumped onto a table, some pieces facing down, others missing entirely. For Alessia, the years between the accident and her rediscovery were shrouded in confusion. She recalled little, often speaking in vague statements, unsure which parts were real and which were dreams. Matteo was advised to move slowly to avoid overwhelming her. Love alone wouldn't be enough, it needed to be paired with patience and trust. He agreed. But inside a storm brewed. 9 years of guilt, hope, and unresolved grief now surged toward the surface. He struggled not to rush the process, not to grasp for something that needed space to bloom on its own. Ariana revealed further findings. Giuliana had taken Alessia days after the crash, presenting herself as a social worker to a rural clinic that had found the girl wandering, dazed and bruised. Without proper ID or oversight, the overwhelmed staff had accepted Giuliana's story. Within hours, she disappeared with Alessia across regional lines. The case had slipped through bureaucratic cracks, a tragic but not uncommon failure in high-pressure emergency zones. Furthermore, Giuliana wasn't working alone. Her name had surfaced in financial records tied to Lorenzo Bianco's network, The same criminal syndicate suspected of trafficking identities, not just individuals. Their operations included creating entire false lives paperwork histories, even school credentials for children meant to be relocated under the radar. Alessia was meant to become someone else entirely. This revelation hit Matteo harder than the DNA results. He realized his daughter had been on the brink of total erasure, not physically, but emotionally, socially, and legally. If not for the spontaneous drawing, she might have lived her entire life unaware of her origins. The thought chilled him. Meanwhile, Alessia had been placed in a temporary care center under protection. She barely spoke during the first few days. At night, she sometimes woke up screaming. Other times, she whispered lullabies in her sleep songs Celeste used to sing. It was these quiet moments that made Matteo ache the most. They were remnants of the past fragments that proved something beautiful still lived inside her. One afternoon, he brought a small memory box to her. Inside was a collection of gentle artifacts, a stuffed rabbit with one ear sewn back, on a faded photo of Celeste holding a toddler on a swing, and a postcard from the Amalfi Coast with Matteo's handwriting on the back. Alessia stared at them for a long time, saying nothing. Then she reached for the rabbit and held it tightly. Trust, like healing, isn't built overnight. It grows through gestures, presence, and consistency. Matteo began visiting her daily, not as a savior, not as a hero, but as a man simply showing up. He read aloud from her childhood books, sat silently during her art therapy sessions, and waited outside the room whenever she needed space. He didn't push. He let her come to him. Eventually, Alessia began asking small questions. What was my mom like? Did we have a garden? Did I like peaches? Matteo answered each one with care, grounding every memory in love rather than loss. He didn't glamorize the past. Instead, he honored it. Speaking of Celeste's laugh, the way Alessia used to splash in fountains, and how their favorite Saturday treat had been pistachio gelato from a tiny shop in Rome. Over time, she started to smile. Not often, and not always when expected. But the smile was real, and it was hers. One evening, as the sun set over the Venice skyline, Alessia asked to walk outside. With the social worker nearby, she and Matteo strolled along a quiet canal. Boats passed silently, casting slow-moving shadows on the stone walls. Alessia turned to him, her voice uncertain. "Do you still want to be my dad?" The question knocked the breath from his chest. He knelt to tears already stinging his eyes. "I've always been your dad," he whispered. "And I always will be. Even when you didn't remember me, I never stopped being yours." They stood there for a long time, the canal reflecting the pink and gold of the sky above. There was no dramatic music, no sweeping montage, just two people finding each other again, step by hesitant step. Ultimately, the truth beneath the surface wasn't just about names or documents. It was about memory pain and the courage to start again. Alessia's journey to reclaim herself would take years. There would be therapy setbacks, moments of doubt. But there would also be light, gentle, persistent light. And for the first time in nearly a decade, Matteo Romano believed in tomorrow again. Not because it was easy, but because love, however delayed, had finally found its way back home. The small town of Cortona in the Tuscan hills shimmered under the early spring light. The villa Matteo Romano, once sold after losing his wife and daughter, had now been reclaimed and restored, not to its former glory, but to something more honest, lived in and open. The rooms were no longer haunted by what was missing. Instead, they carried a quiet promise of healing. Alessia had chosen the curtains herself, light blue, like the sea she vaguely remembered. It was her way of claiming space in a home that once only existed in photographs. However, reintegration into each other's lives was not a simple homecoming. Healing is not linear. Some mornings, Alessia woke up smiling, craving pancakes. Other days, she refused to speak, retreating into long silences, her fingers picking at the hem of her sleeve. Matteo had learned not to panic. Instead, he offered consistency. A soft knock, a breakfast plate, a warm cup of tea left on her desk. It was these simple rituals that began to rebuild their bond. They also attended weekly therapy sessions together. The therapist helped them navigate the emotional labyrinth of trauma and reconnection. She explained that children like Alessia often internalize guilt even when they logically understand they were victims. For example, Alessia sometimes apologized for things she didn't remember doing, like not recognizing Matteo sooner, or not crying when Juliana was arrested. The therapist described it as survivor's disorientation, a state where the child must reconcile two identities, who they were and who they were forced to become. Outside the therapy room, Alessia started drawing again. Her sketches evolved from vague silhouettes to clear, vivid scenes. One particular drawing Matteo cherished showed a little girl on a swing beneath an olive tree, with two figures watching, one holding a book, the other a camera. It wasn't just art, it was memory returned through creation. Matteo framed it and hung it above the fireplace. Furthermore, Alessia surprised everyone by requesting to visit a local elementary school, not to enroll, but to observe. The headmistress agreed, and Alessia spent an afternoon in the art room, watching children her age laugh, argue, and paint with carefree strokes. That night, over dinner, she said softly, "I want to help kids like me, ones who get lost." Matteo didn't respond immediately. He placed his fork down and looked at her eyes, gentle. "We can build something together. Something that makes sure no one stays lost forever." Inspired by her words, Matteo established the Aurora Center, named after the Latin word for dawn. It began as a small non-profit in Florence, designed to support children who had survived abduction, identity loss, or long-term displacement. Alessia became its youngest ambassador, not as a poster child, but as a quiet presence who helped stock art supplies, greet new families, and occasionally speak to small groups when she felt strong enough. One afternoon, she stood in front of a circle of children and shared, "For a long time, I didn't know my real name. But someone kept looking for me, not just in police records or photos. He looked for who I was inside. That's how I found myself again." Her voice didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. Matteo watched from the back of the room, pride and awe stitched across his face. She wasn't just surviving, she was leading. Outside, the center life found a new rhythm. They planted a garden together, something Celeste had always dreamed of. Alessia chose herbs and sunflowers. Matteo built raised beds. Every weekend they worked side by side, hands-dirty laughter rising in bursts. It wasn't perfect, but perfection had never been the goal. Wholeness was. However, not all days were filled with clarity. Sometimes shadows lingered, Juliana's trial, for example, reopened wounds. Alessia testified behind closed doors, her voice quiet but firm. She did not look at Juliana. When asked if she had anything to say, she simply answered, "I am not yours." The words echoed like a verdict. Juliana received a lengthy sentence, and Alessia never asked about her again. Slowly, Matteo began sharing more about Celeste. They watched home videos, flipped through albums, and visited her grave together. Alessia left a drawing on the headstone, a sketch of their family holding hands under a starlit sky. Matteo traced the outlines with his fingers as if trying to seal that image into his heart. In time, the media attention faded. Interviews ended. People stopped asking intrusive questions. The Romano name was no longer synonymous with tragedy. It became associated with resilience, with advocacy, with starting over. And that suited them just fine. Finally, on the one-year anniversary of Alessia's return, They hosted a small gathering at the villa. Friends, volunteers from the Aurora Center, neighbors, and a few families the center had helped all came together. String lights lit the courtyard. Children chased each other between tables. Matteo gave a short toast, his voice steady. There was a time when this house echoed only with memory. Now it echoes with footsteps, laughter, and love. This is not a story of what we lost. It's a story of what we chose to rebuild. Alessia stood beside him holding his hand. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Her presence was a statement in itself of survival, of homecoming, and of the quiet courage it takes to reclaim your story. As the evening faded into stars, Alessia looked up and whispered, "I feel like I finally came home." Matteo smiled, placing an arm around her shoulders. "You didn't just come home," he said. "You brought it back with you." And in that simple truth, everything else faded: the pain, the silence, the years apart. What remained was enough. Because home was never just a place. It was love found again. In the quiet twilight of the Tuscan countryside, the villa stood peacefully, its walls no longer echoing with sorrow, but softened by laughter, gentle conversations, and the calm rhythm of healing. Matteo Romano, once a man broken by grief, now found himself rediscovering fatherhood, one hesitant moment at a time. Alessia, his daughter lost for 9 years, was no longer just a memory frozen in photographs. She was real again, alive, present, breathing. But recovery was never instant. Their journey had been one of scattered pieces, pieces of a girl taken, a father shattered, a life interrupted. And yet, piece by piece, they had begun to rebuild. Not the life they once had, but a new one, slower, quieter, perhaps, but stitched together with a kind of resilience only those who've lost and found again could understand. There had been nights when Alessia couldn't sleep. Her dreams, pierced by fragments, she didn't fully remember a woman's shadow over her bed, a voice she'd trusted that twisted into fear. Matteo would sit silently in the hallway outside her door, not always entering but always waiting. It was in these small acts of presence, of patience, that their bond strengthened. They had to relearn each other. Alessia wasn't the toddler Matteo once read bedtime stories to, and Matteo wasn't the same man she had last seen as a child. Yet, through every awkward breakfast, every uncertain hug, every wordless drawing she left on his desk, trust slowly returned. It came not as a tidal wave, but as a morning mist, soft, gradual, undeniable. Matteo had expected to reclaim his daughter. What he didn't expect was how much she would teach him in return. Alessia's quiet strength, her intuitive sensitivity to the pain of others, and her unyielding will to reclaim her voice inspired everyone around her. She didn't just want to heal, she wanted to help others heal too. That's why the Aurora Center wasn't just a project, it was her legacy in motion. A safe space for children like her. A place where no one would feel invisible. And it wasn't only about shelter or therapy. It was about reclaiming identity, memory, and the right to be seen. One spring afternoon, standing beneath the olive tree they'd planted together, Alessia turned to Matteo and asked, "Do you think we would have found each other if I hadn't drawn that house?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, her eyes so full of life now, no longer burdened with questions she had to carry alone. "I think," he said finally, "you were calling to me, even when you didn't know it. And I was listening even when I didn't understand." That was the truth beneath it all. Not just the miracle of reunion, but the invisible thread that binds those who love deeply. Time, distance, silence. None of these were enough to sever what was written in the soul. Their story reminds us that family isn't just blood, it's perseverance, it's trust rebuilt after betrayal, and it's choosing every single day to show up for one another. Not just when it's easy, but especially when it's hard. So, What can we take from Matteo and Alessia's journey? First, never stop looking for what matters most. Life will try to distract us, discourage us, tell us that certain losses are final. But hope, real hope, is a discipline. It's the act of believing even when evidence is thin and continuing even when everyone else has stopped. Second, healing doesn't look the same for everyone. For some, it's loud and expressive. For others, it's quiet and unseen. But it always begins with safety and grows through presence. If you know someone who's been hurt, remember being there consistently and gently may be the most powerful gift you can offer. And finally, forgiveness isn't forgetting. Matteo will never forget what was taken from him. Alessia will never erase the years she spent lost. But they chose not to let those years define them. They chose love, and from that choice a new future was built, not perfect, but deeply meaningful. As you reflect on this story, maybe you're carrying your own unanswered questions. Maybe you're waiting for something or someone to come back. If that's you, hold on, stay open. Life has a way of turning the page when we least expect it. If this story moved you, made you think of someone you love, or reminded you of your own strength, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and share in your journey too. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told real stories, with heart and hope, please consider subscribing to our channel. It helps us continue creating content that connects, heals, and inspires. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones with the loudest voices, but the ones that reach us exactly when we need them most. Thank you for watching. And remember, you are never truly lost as long as someone somewhere is still looking for you.